Quite a lot of you in recent videos have been asking me what Sigma art lenses and the Canon EF lenses are like in terms of autofocus performance on the Sony a7 III. Now, I haven't actually been able to answer that question because unfortunately I don't have any native Sony lenses to test that theory on. Oh wait, yes I do. So this is the first of my native Sony lenses to arrive. It's the Zeiss 55mm f1.8 and it is going to be replacing my Sigma 50mm f1.4 art lens. So with this video, let's do a comparison as to how this lens stacks up against this lens. And then in the autofocus section, I've also thrown in a native Canon lens just to see how well it works. So firstly, let's talk about build quality. So firstly, the size difference between these two, because it's quite noticeable. Obviously, bear in mind that the Sigma 50mm is a DSLR designed lens with the MC11 adapter on. But even if you get the new FE version that is native to Sony cameras, it's still going to be exactly the same size. And compared to the Zeiss, there's a world of difference. The Zeiss is almost half the length of the Sigma. Then in terms of just overall size as well, the Zeiss has a 49mm front filter versus the 77 of the Sigma. So you're looking at a lens that is about 40% shorter, about 25% narrower, and probably about half the weight as well. But they haven't skimped on actual build quality. The Sigma is made up of kind of mainly metal and thermal composite plastic. The Zeiss exterior is all metal and the thing feels really solid even though it's only small. So in terms of build quality, yes, the Sigma is very impressive, but it comes at a cost of weight, whereas the Zeiss doesn't. In terms of the weight of the Sigma, this is one of the reasons why I'm switching over to the Zeiss, because I love this lens, don't get me wrong. I've had this lens for about 3 or 4 years. Obviously, like I've mentioned in previous videos, there is the autofocus inconsistencies with Sigma lenses, but as long as you know how to work around them, it's not that big a deal. But the size and weight of these things, while being well suited to a DSLR, isn't really best suited to a mirrorless camera. You know, while I've had DSLRs for years and I've just grown accustomed to them, there are times when the weight just kills me. You know, I might be about to turn 30 on paper, but sometimes I feel like I have the body of a 60-year-old. So having 2 big DSLR bodies and numerous kind of heavy prime lenses or big zoom lenses just starts to knacker you out by the end of a day. So a big factor in me switching to mirrorless was the opportunity to kind of downsize my kit, and this is one of the things that the Zeiss lens offers. So the problem with this in terms of weight is kind of partial the total weight, but also how the weight's placed. Because obviously this is a DSLR lens on an adapter, or even the new FE version is going to basically be a DSLR version with an extension on the back of it. You've basically got no weight here and then all the weight up front. So when it's mounted on the camera, the whole thing feels a lot more front heavy than it would be if the optics were spaced out along the entire barrel. And one of the first things I noticed about the optics of this lens when I got the thing was the way that they've designed it in order to make the lens compact. Because the rear optic is right up to the back of the lens, which you would expect from a DSLR because it's so much further away from the sensor. I wasn't expecting it on a mirrorless camera. But the other thing that I noticed with this is that usually with lenses, particularly as you go kind of wider and wider on the focal length, is the front element is kind of rounded more and more, or a convex shape. But with this lens, Zeiss have done the complete opposite. They've actually made the front element concave so it curves inwards. Now, presumably they've done this in order to shrink down the size and weight of the lens. And hats off to them, they've done a very good job. But how does it stack up optically? Because obviously Sigma art lenses are kind of generally regarded as being exceptionally good optically, even if the autofocus sometimes lets them down. However, we're talking about Zeiss glass here. So having done a couple of standardized tests between these lenses, there's really not a lot to choose. When shot at their widest apertures, both in the center and in the corners, both lenses look exceptionally sharp. Possibly a hair advantage to the Zeiss, but then also bear in mind that the Sigma is at f1.4 rather than f1.8, which is a bit more of a strain optically. When shot at the same aperture, both lenses look very similar. Now for the big question on everybody's mind, the autofocus. So for this, I compared up the Zeiss 55 versus the Sigma 50mm using the MC11 adapter, and the Canon 70-200 IS Mark II also on the Sigma MC11 adapter. So for this test, I didn't shoot a video using the A7 III and then just show you how the different lenses autofocus, because I noticed that the autofocus in video is kind of slightly slower than shooting stills. So I tested the autofocus in stills mode and then just used a second camera recording the back of the A7 III here to show you how quickly each lens focused. So what I've found is that the Zeiss is very fast at autofocusing, locks on pretty much straight away if you are in good light, and is pretty much inaudible even if you press your ear against the lens. Now the Sigma, if you're shooting in good light, it actually feels almost a fraction quicker, which I presume is down to the HSM motor in that lens being faster than whatever motor system they're using in the Zeiss. The Sigma, however, is much more audible when it is autofocusing. There's certainly a noticeable kind of juddering noise as it's micro adjusting the focus. Now that was just focusing in and around sort of the center third of the sensor. I also tested corner autofocus because on a DSLR, this is something that I've noticed as being a weakness of the Sigma lenses. If you try and focus out towards the edge of the sensor, the autofocus goes to rat. Thankfully, however, on Sony cameras, that doesn't happen. I set a subject up in the very corner of the screen. Both the Zeiss and the Sigma, when starting from close focus, locked onto the subject straight away, no questions asked. I also tested this with the Canon, and this is where the Canon falls on its arse, because using the MC11 adapter, there's obviously communication issues, there's obviously something that it's not happy about. The lens will focus perfectly fine if you're shooting in the kind of middle third of the frame, but the moment you try using the outer areas of the sensor to focus, the lens just cannot lock on anything. It will just hunt back and forth, back and forth. It doesn't even show any signs of hesitation like it thinks it might have caught focus. So if you're focusing primarily around the center portion of the sensor, pretty much where you would expect to focus with a DSLR, Canon lenses do seem to work okay, although they're slightly slower than the Sigma and the Sony lenses. Sigma and Sony both seem to work exceptionally well in terms of autofocus all the way across the frame in good light. However, if you work in a slightly darker environment, this is where the Sony has the edge. So I tested the Sigma and Sony in a dark room before and found the Sony works very well. There's a small amount of hunting. It focuses pretty much all the way there, and then it almost hesitates for a split second before acquiring focus, and you're good to go. The Sigma, however, there's far more noticeable hesitation. It's almost like it has to micro adjust 2 or 3 times before it's satisfied that it has found focus. So to answer the question of Canon versus Sigma versus Sony, Canon in good light, if you're using the center of the frame, are okay. Lower light, there's a bit of hesitation. Edges, forget it. Sigma works very well in terms of autofocus accuracy and speed all the way across the frame if you're shooting in good light. Shooting in dimmer light, it will still acquire focus. There's just a bit more of a delay in getting there in the first place. Sony works faultlessly in daylight and pretty well in dark light, considering you can't actually see. So between the Zeiss and the Sigma, which do I prefer? Well, I'm sticking with the Zeiss, because the only real advantage to the Sigma is that it has a 1.4 aperture versus a 1.8. But when I was using this lens on a DSLR, I never really shot it at f1.4 all that much, because the depth of field was so razor thin that the autofocus then became kind of too unreliable. So I generally tend to stop down to about f2 anyway. And there's no real benefit in terms of sharpness for this lens over the Zeiss, but the whole lens is just a lot bigger and a lot heavier. In terms of price, there's not a lot to choose from them. If you already own the Sigma 50mm lens, then it's just the price of the MC11 adapter, which is about £150–200. So could be worthwhile you keeping if you already have the lens. If you're buying from scratch, you've got two options. You either buy the Sigma lens in a Canon EF mount and then buy the adapter, which would probably set you back anything from about £600–900 depending if you're buying new or used. Or you wait for the native FE version of this lens, which currently B&H have on pre-order for $1,000 US, which for that price you can get the Zeiss. Now, as I said, the main reason why I got this lens and why I went to mirrorless in the first place is to downsize my kit. So that and the fact that this lens is just as good optically and better in terms of autofocus than this is why I am going with the Zeiss. But what about you? Which do you prefer? Do you prefer the Zeiss? Do you prefer the Sigma? Or do you prefer a different lens altogether? Leave your comment down below. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for stopping by. And as always, hopefully, I will see you in the next video.